presentation on game mechanics and collaborative storytelling. My name is Drew Smith. I am lucky enough to be a teacher of filmmakers, philosophers, and actors at Stillwater Area Public Schools. And again, this is going to be on YouTube for those of you following along. I've also got my Twitter handle and Google ID there, so if you're ever wanting to say, hey, I saw you talk about this thing, can you help me out with X, Y, and Z? I would love to do that. Again, if you're in the room watching this, please mute your speakers so that we don't get that annoying feedback thing with that. So I just want to talk a little bit about, first, what the heck are collaborative storytelling games? Because if we go with people like Jesper Juul, who is a very large name in game design, ludology, things like that, you can find many different lectures, arguments, flame wars on the internet about what is a game. Is something like Gone Home a game? Is this or that, you know, insert interesting thing going on that's not really the norm, is it a game right now? And this is Jesper Juul's criteria, and he's got, goes into great detail on all of these different dimensions of what is or is not a game, and I've got the white paper for that, as well as his website. Wow, you can get lost down that rabbit hole for a long time with all the things he's got. But the point that I wanted to come to with this, in terms of trying to find story games and talk about story games with educators, is that he likens storytelling to watching a fireplace. Not terribly engaging, not terribly interactive, and that's why some of these games really don't fit. All of the games that I'm going to be sharing with you today are games that are usually called GM-less, or games masterless, or facilitatorless games. And that doesn't mean that we as educators would not have a place in using these games to work with students, but it means that they're not built to have one person with that power. They're actually inherently, at their very base level, built to involve everyone. One of the best-selling tabletop games right now in 2015, Pandemic Legacy, one of the first things you do is you choose your role within a game with this. And a lot of these games involve different periodic roles in the aim of creating a story. That's why these games take place. So it's important to note these are kind of unconventional games with this. It doesn't mean that we won't talk about using cards and rolling dice and things like that. We will, but it's to create stories. That's the win state. Creating an excellent story that they wouldn't have had anywhere else if they hadn't been playing this game with these people at that moment with it. At its base, storytelling games are grounded in what we call an aleatory additive mechanic, which is talking about adding chaos or controlled chaos to creation, to the process of creation with it, which does make it a little bit more than just watching a fireplace, and there's chance involved. There are options involved, but this goes back to things like the idea of the exquisite corpse, a surrealistic exercise where each person adds to the picture or adds to the sentence based without knowing what the rest of the participants have added, but just based on their given task, be it a part of speech or a part of the body, that they add to this to create a new whole with this. And you can get unexpected, surprising beauty when you work with this kind of exercise. If you spend 2 seconds Googling the exquisite corpse, you'll get some really odd drawings as well. I don't recommend that with an open classroom. But you can get some amazing things out of it. You can get some wonderfully unexpected things out of it. But that's part of what this is about, these story games are about, is weighing the chance, weighing students' own input with your content area to create new stories, to create new things with this. And I just like to, where I come from on this, a little quick thought experiment is if you take whatever your dominant hand is and you extend your index finger and you place it out where you think your nose is, and then you close the eye of that dominant hand, and that's kind of camera one. Then close the other eye, camera two, camera one, camera two, camera one. And I've watched my 3-year-old thinks this is awesome. He thinks this is great, and it just, every so often I can just hear a certain kind of guffaw from him, and I know he's playing camera 1, camera 2. But this is the basis of our vision. Our vision is stereoscopic. We see things by threading images together in our head. And if you look at this image here, the camera obscura, we have created art and images and stories from these flipped images. That's how we create meaning. And that's part of the way I use these games with it. It's not, could you play these games without any kind of academic content? You could, but you can make academic content come alive with these games, because it's not just a worksheet anymore. It's not in English class reading the book and just talking about it. Now you make something with it, which I think goes to the heart of things like the maker movement that we talked about this morning. That's a part of this conference. And story games let your students interact with the text by making something new. I think that's extremely important to note with this, as well as it's really fun to play camera 1, camera 2. And you did that. My 3-year-old's talking about. So how this presentation is going to go, I kind of like to approach this from a scaffolding kind of thing. Yes, I've used and created and modded some of these games, but I'm also a consumer of it. I've also included the links to all of the publisher websites, so you could go and take a look at the consumer products of these, and I highly recommend that you do so. These are very creative individuals, some of which are educators on the day side for them, but they're all very passionately concerned about telling great stories, and I urge you to support them. I'm going to talk about what's the mechanic of the game, what's the moving part, what's the weird thing that would get students engaged with these stories and making stories, and how would you use it in the classroom. And I've tried to put assets out there also, some of the things I've created to try and make it a little bit easier. I wish I had something like this when I started doing it. I would have gotten back so much more time in terms of working with my students. So, these resources are out there in the Google Hangout. Please take a look at them, and also please ask questions, because that's what I'm going to be basing a lot of my time on with you today. In terms of, I'm going to go through these at a pretty breakneck pace, hit you with a lot of stuff, and then I want you to ask me questions, talk about my experience with the kids in my classroom, so that hopefully you'll want to use these with your students in your classrooms. And so that's kind of how we're going to scaffold this up. The first one is the idea of a card mechanic. And really the great thing about some of these card mechanics-based games, you can use these before reading, during reading, and after reading. I've used these in all facets of working with text. I've included the template and the links to a game called Nanofictionary Cards, which is kind of a deck building game. And it's a very simple way to get students working with the ideas of plot. I think I've got characters, conflict setting, and resolutions in the template that I've shared with you. But it's great in that each student just kind of creates a card with a very basic kind of understanding with things. And they put together their deck as a group. And the randomization comes from, they don't know if they're going to get their cards, work with other people's cards, or some combination of both. It's, for the math probability people out there, it's the combination of both. But this is great where I like to use that template and say, I want so many of these cards to be from your reading of To Kill a Mockingbird over the summer. I want you to use 2 characters. I want 1 setting from the book. I want 1 conflict from the book. And then the rest you fill in yourself. I want to hear about the things that you think are interesting. What are the cool stories that you've interacted with these kinds of things? And you keep it small, just what can fit on a card. Games like Apples to Apples, Cards Against Humanity, all sorts of things like that are using a card mechanic where people have their own hand, what they're doing, and play them out with it. This is building upon that. So it works with that idea of making allusions to other things. Part of it's your content that you're working with, but also part of it is what they bring to the table. What are they interested in with this? Another way I like to work with these cards is I like to use to kind of cycle up taxonomy. You could take the template I've got in the assets, strip out the literary elements, You could look for characters. You could look for conflict. You could look for theme. You could look for, go after some of your bigger picture things with it that way. And the big thing is they create a group deck based on their work with this, but it is an individual thing that they use. So the group interaction of a card-based mechanic like this causes what they get in their hand, and sometimes I like to keep it, something like a 5-card kind of thing, that they have in their hand and they're going to create with their stories. It is a little bit more randomized and interesting way than saying that they have to create certain things, one from each person. You don't know what you're going to get. They can't game for that on their end, and that unknown makes things a little bit more interesting. But then you can get a game like Primetime Adventures. And Primetime Adventures is incredibly adaptive. The premise of the game is that you are creating a TV series. And it's a TV series that you create episodes, a series of episodes, either 3, 5, or 9 episode season in what you're creating with your students. And if you really have the time, I've done a 9-season episode once. I'm not telling you to start there. But a 3 and a 5-season episode are very accessible, can fit into a lot of different timelines. It's protagonist propelled in that the students create the protagonists and the characters that they want to do. I had a group of students reading Great Expectations, set it as an Egyptian murder mystery, because that's the stuff they wanted to do with it. What does Pip look like in that world? What does Havisham look like in that world? You get into some very interesting conversations just in creating the characters. What makes this game work, before we get to the cards, is that there's also screen presence. Every character is involved in an episode in Primetime Adventure, but their screen presence changes. They might be a 1, a minimal screen presence, a 2, moderate, or a 3. This is their episode. This is their thing. And the wonderful thing about Primetime Adventures is that it charts out all of that stuff for you in terms of how many times can somebody be a 3 versus a 2 versus a 1. On that, they've got charts for that for you. But where it gets interesting is the draw. So you've got this series, they've got their characters that they've kind of formed up as a pastiche, and then they write their stakes. And the stakes are an individual success and failure state. What could happen successfully, or what kind of failure could exist for that character within the course of the episode. Now this eliminates some objectives to writing, or objections to writing right away, because they know what kind of end they've got to go to, which sometimes we've all read some of those student stories where we don't know where it ended. Some of them are still going right now out in the ether if we're not careful. And Primetime Adventures builds in, with every episode, you know what your character has to do. You know your success, you know your failure, which one is it? And you draw cards for it. If you're a 1, you only get to draw 1 card. If you're a 2, 2. If you're a 3, 3. And you add up the numbers from dark and red suits, and if you have more in your red total than black, your character gets a success. And then you know what they've got. And it's very hard for them to game this. And it's nice because you can also be a producer. You can challenge. I usually would challenge that they'd have to use certain vocabulary within their stakes. But also, if they didn't like what they got, if they were a 2 and they said, I really wanted to write this for this chapter, can you help me out here? I said, well, I can draw against you. You're a 2, I can draw 2 cards, and if I get a success, I can overturn what you're doing. You can also use that to push students with a 2 that way. So it's got I've seen students standing on their feet, ready to draw for getting ready to write with this. It's a great card mechanic. One thing with Primetime Adventures, I don't like the fan mail system. within this game. It is based on a series of using pennies as tokens, and it's things that people like over a given episode create a budget, and that carries over from episode to episode, and it can be kind of unwieldy. It can get more about keeping track of the pennies and the fan mail and the numbers than it is about writing your stories. And that's what I think what we want them to be doing, is creating and making stories. So I try to keep it streamlined to the cards and their screen presence, just to simplify, just to streamline things with this. And I think I've included in the assets kind of, I think they call it the Primetime Adventures for Busy People setup kind of thing. Keeps that moving along and keeps the focus on story for you. This is one of my favorite games. If you're not familiar with Fiasco, oh, I wish I was you, because it's such a wonderful thing to discover, this game. Full disclosure, I am also doing a session on this game tomorrow. So if you don't understand this or are still interested, Fiasco is great. It is a game made to create a story like a Coen Brothers movie, where unexpected things happen, there's conflict, and there is some kind of calamitous end with it. And man, do students get hyped up for this one. I have read some of my best student work has come from this game. It's a game inherently from 3 to 5 players. Really cool thing with playing a game of Fiasco is I can have some kind of character relationship with the person to the left of me, one to the person to the right of me, but I can't really decide all of it. I could say that I have a crime relationship with this person, but then they get to decide if they're the boss and I'm the muscle. I could say that maybe that the person to the right of me says, well, we're in a family character relationship. Then I get to say, yeah, but we're the twin siblings that never get along, kind of thing. You use dice with Fiasco. You roll dice, but it's anchored in this idea of divider-chooser game theory math, actually. Because nobody can both set and define a relationship. You need your group with it. So one person may get to choose the element, but the other one further defines it. That creates buy-in and helps build conflict with it. It's, again, with that divider-chooser ideology of, if we have some kind of wonderful resource like cake or pie, the fairest distribution between 2 people is to have one person divide it, but the other one gets to choose. And that's the way we get to work with our involvement with that. And that's my other video for that. With it, I've got a whole thing on the setup is a little bit more detailed with it, but I do have templates for you also within it about how to get the setup rolling and work through that a little more in detail. The wonderful thing about Fiasco is it is grounded in a 912 literature arts standard in 3-act structure. It's also a 3-act structure, what most of our media is going on, television and film-wise. Your setup is leads into your first act. We have a tilt. There are 2 elements of conflict that get thrown in by demand in the second act. And in the third act of Fiasco, everyone knows their fate, but everyone is trying to create a montage to get there, based on their involvement and based on how scenes have played out. One rule I love about Fiasco is because you use the dice both to fill things out on your game sheet and create the relationships between your characters' needs, your characters' objects that they work with, the locations. The great rule with this is that the last die is always wild at any phase of the game, because you get your people involved with it. You get those players at that table into their story and what kind of crazy things are going on with their characters, and they don't have the right dice numbers showing up that they can't work with it. That doesn't let you do that. The last die is wild, lets them go with their writing and lets them go with their storytelling with that. And it is this just wonderful house of cards that all comes crashing down by the end, which, if you've kind of ever watched a smaller kid play with blocks or Legos or things, and again, maybe this is because I have a 3- and a 5-year-old at home, there is that idea, that wonderful phase of building something up. but they're gonna just as much love to crash that thing down at the end of it. And we get caught up, I think, so much in forms of writing and forms of storytelling, we don't necessarily focus on our ends as well. Fiasco builds in the end for your stories with that. There's never any question about it. The interesting part is how you get there. It builds a focus on the journey, and that's why I love Fiasco. Fiasco is also built on a lot of different play sets. Also with this Fiasco, there are play sets that exist for everything from London, 1593, to an Arctic research station, a la John Carpenter's Thing, to suburban John Hughes-esque kinds of things. There is a wealth of play sets out there. They even create a second edition of the game just for people who want to write your own play set. And that's where I've had some great things with my students in terms of they create their own play set based on how much of the content I ask them to put in. So, okay, we're reading Count of Monte Cristo, but you want to set it in a future asteroid penal colony where someone's got to break out into deep space with that. Well, what kind of things can we use from the text and still tell your story with it? And those are the really great experiences my students have had in terms of using Fiasco, is taking the content and blending it into their own thing with the game. And I've got the templates for you on how to create that also in the assets there, walking you through the different steps with that. The most adaptable game I'm going to talk to you about today is without a doubt Microscope. Microscope is the game that got me interested in story games. One of my students came to me, knew I liked video games, knew I liked film, things like that. They said, have you heard of this thing, Microscope? And I hadn't really. Microscope, in essence, is a big timeline. It's a very big timeline, and you arrange everything out on it. But it is adaptable to virtually any kind of storytelling world, I would say. Because the base supposition of the game Microscope is that plot is a fractal, and that you can get something good out of it no matter how much you want to drill down into it, which is what I think I try to teach my students about. That's why we tell stories with this, and I want them to get to tell their own. And that's where this comes in. One of the things that's nice with playing a game of Microscope is that you start out with your bookends. The players decide what is our start history, what is our end history point with that. Now, if you're in a social studies classroom, you might have a very set year range and a country set for them with that. You can set those things as you go with it. Maybe you want it to be the reign of Napoleon's 100 days, very specific time period within France to help understand something like Count of Monte Cristo. Maybe I want it to be looking at Elizabethan England in terms of some of the turnover in the church, things like that. You can set your bookends of where your beginning and end points are. But the one thing for student engagement, the mechanic that I really love with this timeline, is that it creates a palette. Every player needs to put in at least 2 things that they want to have happen in their story, and 1 thing that they don't like. You know, some people like, nope, no time travel, don't like it, don't want it. Some people, no alien, whatever. And there are ways you can settle mutually agreeing upon what are the out-of-bound things, what are the things we don't want to see in it, but it creates more options, more focus on the things they want to, and array the palette of the options that they like with this. The first pass through in Microscope, everyone puts down both a period of time as well as one event within that period. So you start setting out your timeline, and then it starts to have these kind of icicles almost develop within it, where we get into different kinds of focus with this. And each turn, you choose something else. You jump to something else. Maybe I established this period wherein the empire rises within it. But I want to go, they set up When the Empire Falls. I really like this event that they're going with. That's the scene I want to focus on and play out more of. And I want to add the characters to that. What kind of people exist within that event in the story? And you can get this amazing spectrum in playing Microscope. Microscope is great as with Primetime Adventures. You can play that just using cards. Primetime Adventures you can play with the cards that you can just cut out with paper with it. Fiasco, your play sets are basically printouts and dice with it. You can play them in an online sandbox kind of environment if you want with it. There's a great Google Plus community for story gaming with that. But you can also just do that pencil and paper. Microscope, and I've got a photo of it here, simply played with note cards and pens. And you can kind of see where the cards stack, where people have decided to focus down. They shade in the event in a circle according to tone with it, so you can spend some time with that. Some teachers I've seen work with it even use different gradated colored cards for things to help kind of dictate some of the story flow with it, that you must have this many of these kind of things with this. But the nice thing with all of these games, storytelling games, is they all build in a visual progression. When I struggle with students that maybe have a hard time with linear processing, or students that have a hard time with recall, things like that, that the visible process, some kind of tangible thing you have out on the table or on their desk or on your projector, that they can look up and they can see the flow of the story with it, I think is just invaluable for this kind of thing. So in a game like Microscope, they can see what are the events that are open, which are the ones that have really been drilled into with this, what ones have really been focused on. I recommend, again, Padlet is a great option for doing this. This is where you can get some great multimedia things, get some YouTube clips worked into some of the, we can work on allusions, tie some of those things in. And it allows for a setup just like this. Corkboard is another one. There are hours and hours of gameplay out there on YouTube of wonderful sessions of Microscope. Some tax the outer limits of Google Hangouts on air, topping out, I want to say, 5 to 7 hours with it. It's amazing how invested people can be in these stories with it. And something like Google Plus, a Google Hangout on air, you don't even have to have these people in the same room with this. You can set up your collaborative documents, add the objects in as you go, and create your storyline as follows with this. So it really is a wonderful thing, but it is a timeline and note cards, essentially, for this. Before I start to go into questions here, both on the floor as well as in the Hangout, there are some things that I recommend to front load this process. One is the idea of tangential learning, in that, believe it or not, our students will actually learn things if we don't have a worksheet on it in front of them. If you give things a weird name from a different time period or a different place, but you're talking about a near future, dystopian future thing, but you give it a character name set from feudal Japan, they're going to kind of wonder about that. Why did that happen? That's an example of tangential learning that might get them to look into those things and try and make those connections. A simpler, easier onboard thing, if you haven't played the Wikipedia game, it's a great start a unit, start a year. It's a wonderful thing to bridge from texts or content areas. The Wikipedia game, it's just like 6 Degrees of Separation, or we've all probably, maybe it's just me, played 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, where you take like 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, you give an actor or a film, how many films can we jump to get to something Kevin Bacon's been in? You could play it with Steve Buscemi if you want it to be a little bit easier. With this, there is a whole thing within Wikipedia. There are different ways to play the Wikipedia game using clicks within Wikipedia and rule sets. That's why on Wikipedia's homepage, there is that button for random entry. Is people playing this game with this? You know, how many clicks can you get from To Kill a Mockingbird to the movie Cars? And I had a student do it rather quickly, and that they both have Oscar nominations attached to them, you know, things like that. But I've got in the assets there. There are iPad apps, different apps for doing the Wikipedia game, but you can also just get online and play the Wikipedia game with it. So I've got links to that with it. Kirby Ferguson's Elements of Creativity, his series Remix, Everything is a Remix, where he states that you can really get to a lot of different things by just looking at the copy, transform, and combine. And Ferguson's work is wonderful for this idea of remixing content, because he does wonderful side-by-side things with looking at George Lucas, the original Star Wars film, and side-by-side with the Akira Kurosawa stuff that he took from it. Looking at Led Zeppelin's lyrics and the bands that they toured with, where does that, I mean, he does this stuff right side by side on screen for you. It's a very powerful conversation with students, but it also gives them a blueprint of copying part of the content that you're working with. How can they transform it and maybe combine it with something else in another content area even that they're working in. Nick Susanis is another one. His book, Unflattening, is where I got some of the Thought Experiment Camera 1, Camera 2 materials. If you're familiar with the book Flatland, about the two-dimensional person talking with the three-dimensional, this takes that up a whole other set of rungs, works in Marcuse, Plato's Allegory of the Cave, and a lot of other things. And it's his, I think it's Columbia doctoral thesis about why a graphic novel could be a doctoral thesis. The wonderful text. I urge you to take a look at it. If you want to do story gaming, look at doing it small. I've had some wonderful things like 6-word fiction created with story gaming, 55-word fiction. These are things that a lot of us have probably done at different phases with it, but making that a part of the product. If the product is smaller, it creates less of an objection and makes buy-in inherently easier. If they think, well, if all I've got to do is 6 words, all I've got to do is 55, I can do 55 words. And they don't maybe stop and think about that's actually extremely difficult to try and get all these things in there. But it eliminates some of those objections to things. Graphic novels are another one. Having graphic novels as maybe one act of your story with it is another way to work. Wonderful cross-curricular options for that. So what I want to do here with my time now with all of you is to open up questions. I'm going to end the Hangout here, and I'm going to go and take a look at both the questions we've got in the Hangout as well as questions here on the floor and kind of go into that.